He was 19 years old when the water in his canteen froze solid inside his jacket. December 1950, Chosin Reservoir. Hell had frozen over, and 30,000 American soldiers were trapped inside it. They called it the Forgotten War, but for those who survived it, forgetting was never an option. The temperature dropped to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. So cold that morphine froze in the medics' syringes. So cold that men's tears crystallized on their faces before they could fall. So cold that touching metal with bare skin meant leaving pieces of yourself behind. Private First Class James Warren from Ohio had never seen snow before he shipped out to Korea. Now he was surrounded by it, buried in it, dying in it. The Chinese had appeared like ghosts in the night, 120,000 of them pouring down from the mountains, bugles screaming, whistles shrieking. The sound still haunts the dreams of those who heard it. In the darkness, American positions were overrun. Men fought with frozen fingers that could barely pull triggers. Frostbite claimed more casualties than bullets. When the blood hit the snow, it steamed for a moment, then froze into crimson ice. They weren't supposed to be there. MacArthur had promised they'd be home by Christmas. "The boys will eat turkey in their own dining rooms," he'd said. Instead, they were eating frozen sea rations with bare hands because their gloves had worn through, and using spoons meant losing fingers. The Marines at Chosin weren't just fighting the Chinese. They were fighting the weather, fighting the terrain, fighting the very air that burned their lungs with each breath. They were fighting for the man next to them, because in that frozen hell, that's all that mattered anymore. What happened next would become one of the most legendary fighting retreats in military history. But first, they had to survive the night. And in that darkness, with the temperature still dropping and the enemy closing in, survival seemed like the cruelest joke of all. This is the story of the chosen few. The story your history books barely mention. The story of how ordinary Americans did the impossible in the coldest battle ever fought by the United States military, June 25, 1950. While America slept, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. 7 divisions, 90,000 men, 150 Soviet tanks rumbling south toward Seoul. The Cold War had just turned hot, and nobody saw it coming. Harry Truman was in Missouri when he got the call. The president who had ended one war now faced another. But this wasn't World War II. This was something new, something more dangerous. A proxy war where superpowers would bleed each other through smaller nations. The American military in 1950 was a shadow of its World War II strength. Budget cuts, demobilization. Most of the experienced combat veterans had gone home to build suburban dreams and raise families. The soldiers sent to Korea were occupation troops from Japan, soft from easy duty, equipped with worn-out gear from the last war. They called them the Broken Army. Task Force Smith was the first to face the storm. 540 American soldiers thrown into the path of the North Korean advance. They had obsolete bazookas that bounced off Soviet armor. They had 6 howitzers and rationed ammunition. They had orders to hold the line. On July 5th, they met the enemy at Osan, 30 miles south of Seoul. They held for 7 hours before being overrun. Of 540 men, only 185 made it back. The retreat began immediately. American forces, unprepared and undermanned, fell back toward the port city of Busan. Each day brought fresh humiliation. Each mile surrendered felt like betrayal. The mighty United States Army, victor of Normandy and Iwo Jima, was being chased down the Korean peninsula by an enemy they'd dismissed as peasants. By August, American and South Korean forces were compressed into a defensive perimeter around Busan, the Busan Perimeter. 140 miles of desperation. If it fell, America would suffer its first military defeat. The whole world was watching. Stalin was watching. Mao was watching. But in the heat of that Korean summer, something changed. The soft occupation troops hardened into soldiers. Green lieutenants became combat leaders. The Broken Army began to remember how to fight. They held the perimeter for 6 weeks of brutal combat. They held because they had nowhere left to retreat. Then MacArthur played his masterstroke. On September 15th, he landed Marines at Incheon, 200 miles behind enemy lines. It was insane. It was brilliant. It worked. The North Korean army, stretched thin and far from home, shattered like glass. By October, American forces had crossed the 38th parallel. racing north toward the Chinese border. Victory seemed certain. The war would be over by Christmas. MacArthur promised. What could go wrong? Everything. Because while America celebrated, 300,000 Chinese soldiers were already moving south through the mountains, traveling by night, hiding by day, moving toward a place called Chosin. Thanksgiving Day, 1950, the 1st Marine Division sat down to a hot turkey dinner on the shores of the Chosin Reservoir. Real turkey, flown in from Japan, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. For a moment, in that frozen wilderness, it almost felt like home. Corporal Martin Russ wrote to his mother that night, "We're at the top of the world, Ma. You can see forever up here. Beautiful country if it wasn't so cold. Don't worry about me. The Chinese won't dare come this far south." He was wrong. At that very moment, the Chinese 9th Army Group was completing its movement into the mountains around Chosin. 120,000 men who had marched for weeks through brutal cold, carrying everything on their backs, no vehicles, no supply lines, just determination and orders from Mao himself: destroy the Marines. The Marines were spread thin along a single mountain road that snaked 78 miles from the port of Hungnam to the Chosin Reservoir. One road, no alternatives. If that road was cut, they were trapped. Military textbooks would call it a fatal error. The Marines would call it another day at the office. On the night of November 27th, the temperature plummeted to -25. Then the mountains erupted. Chinese soldiers poured down from the ridges, thousands of them wearing quilted uniforms that made them look like moving haystacks in the darkness. They came in waves, human waves, blowing bugles and whistles, screaming, dying, and still coming. At Udimni, 2 Marine regiments were hit by 6 Chinese divisions. The odds were 3-1 against. In the confusion of that first night, units were overrun, positions lost, men separated from their squads. Private Hector Caffarata, a reservist from New Jersey who'd never seen combat, found himself alone on a hill with one other Marine, facing hundreds of Chinese soldiers. He fought for 8 hours straight, throwing back grenades, firing until his rifle overheated, using his entrenching tool as a club when ammunition ran low. When dawn came, there were over 100 enemy dead in front of his position. His feet were so frostbitten he couldn't walk. They gave him the Medal of Honor. But individual heroism couldn't change the mathematics. The Marines were outnumbered, surrounded, and facing the worst winter weather in 50 years. That's when General Oliver P. Smith, commander of the 1st Marine Division, made the decision that would save his men. When a reporter asked if the Marines were retreating, Smith gave an answer that would echo through history. "Retreat, hell, we're not retreating. We're just advancing in a different direction." It wasn't bravado. It was truth, because Marines don't retreat, they attack. Even when surrounded, even when outnumbered, even when the temperature is so cold that batteries die, vehicles won't start, and weapons malfunction, they attack. And at Chosin, they would attack their way out, fighting for every yard of that frozen road, carrying their wounded, their dead, and their honor with them. The Chinese thought they had trapped the Marines. They were about to learn why Marines don't need to be rescued, they rescue themselves. The cold was an enemy more ruthless than any human force. It didn't discriminate. It killed Americans. It killed Chinese. It killed without mercy or meaning. Medical officers reported something they'd never seen before: men dying from the cold while still fighting. Their bodies kept moving, firing, following orders, even as hypothermia shut down their minds. They called them the walking dead. Soldiers who fought on autopilot until they simply stopped, frozen in place like statues. Dr. Henry Litvin, a Navy surgeon with the Marines, performed operations in temperatures so cold that blood froze as it left the body. He amputated frost-bitten limbs with hacksaws because the cold made surgical instruments brittle as glass. No anesthesia because it was frozen. Men bit down on rifle slings while he cut. The screams echoed off the mountains, but the operations continued. Stop meant death, for everyone. The Chinese suffered worse. They had crossed the border wearing summer uniforms, canvas shoes, no gloves. Their political officers had told them American soldiers were soft, would surrender at first contact. Instead, they met Marines who fought like demons even while freezing to death. Thousands of Chinese soldiers were found frozen in attack positions, rifles still aimed, as if the cold had photographed them at the moment of death. But in this frozen hell, humanity still flickered. Marine Sergeant Robert Kennemore threw himself on a Chinese grenade to save his squad. As medics carried him away, his legs destroyed, he kept asking if his men were okay. Private William Baugh gave his only pair of gloves to a wounded Chinese prisoner, then lost 3 fingers to frostbite. When asked why, he said, "He looked younger than my kid brother." The retreat from Udumne began on December 1st, 14 miles to Hagaruri, 14 miles that would take 4 days and cost over 1,500 casualties. The Chinese controlled the high ground, pouring fire down on the column. Every curve in the road was an ambush. Every hill had to be taken, held, then abandoned as the column moved on. They moved at night because Chinese artillery was more accurate in daylight. They moved in a fighting column, infantry on the flanks, armor when it could move, everyone else in the middle. The wounded rode on trucks, tanks, any vehicle that could move. When vehicles broke down, they destroyed them and transferred the wounded. No one was left behind. That was the promise. That was the code. One image haunted every man who saw it. Chinese dead, frozen in the road, crushed flat by tanks and trucks because there was no way around them. The column couldn't stop. To stop was to die. So they drove over the enemy dead, the bodies crackling like kindling under the tracks, the sound carried in the cold air. Men vomited, men cried, men kept moving. At one point the road was cut completely. Fox Company, 240 Marines, held a critical hill for 5 days against repeated attacks. Without them, the column would have been trapped. By the time they were relieved, only 82 could still fight. The rest were dead or wounded, but they held. In temperatures that killed men standing still, they held. This wasn't war as anyone had imagined it. This was survival at its most primitive. And yet, in that primitive struggle, they maintained what made them Marines. Discipline, courage, brotherhood. They would make it to Hagaruri, then to Kotori, then to the sea. They would do it because they were Marines, and Marines don't know how to quit. At Hagaruri, engineers had carved out an airstrip on frozen ground using explosives and bulldozers. 2,900 feet of rough runway that meant life for the wounded. C-47 transport planes landed on that strip while under fire, loaded wounded, and took off into hostile skies. Pilots called it the most dangerous flying of their lives. They did it anyway. Marine Private First Class Jack London watched the evacuation. They loaded the worst cases first. Guys with no legs, guys holding their guts in, guys so frostbitten they looked like charcoal. But here's what got me. Nobody wanted to go. Wounded Marines were arguing with docs, saying they could still fight. Had to literally order them onto the planes. The airstrip operated for exactly 5 days. In that time, they evacuated 312 wounded and 137 dead. When the last plane lifted off on December 6th, engineers destroyed the strip. Can't leave anything useful for the enemy. That was the rule. Destroy everything you can't carry. But Hagaruri was just a way station. The real challenge lay ahead. The road to Kotori, then down Funchalen Pass to the sea. 11 miles from Hagaru to Koto. Doesn't sound like much, until you realize those 11 miles included some of the worst terrain in Korea, defended by fresh Chinese divisions who knew the Marines were coming. General Smith made a decision that would define the breakout. Instead of rushing, instead of panicking, the Marines would advance methodically, take the high ground, clear each position, move only when ready. "We'll fight our way out the way Marines are supposed to fight," he said. It would take longer, it would cost lives, but it would work. The column that left Hagaru on December 6th stretched for miles. 10,000 Marines and soldiers, 1,000 vehicles, thousands of Korean refugees who attached themselves to the column because it was their only hope. The Chinese attacked constantly, day and night, from ridges, from valleys, from positions so well camouflaged they were invisible until they opened fire. Staff Sergeant William Windrich held a roadblock alone for hours while his company reorganized. When they found his body, he was surrounded by dead Chinese soldiers. He'd been shot 12 times and was still holding his weapon. They counted 40 enemy dead around his position. One man. 40 enemies. Those were Chosin numbers. The most critical moment came at Funchalen Pass. The Chinese had blown a bridge over a 2,500-foot gorge. Without that bridge, no vehicles could pass. No vehicles meant leaving the wounded. Leaving the wounded was not an option. So the Air Force did something that had never been done before. They airdropped bridge sections by parachute. 8 sections, each weighing 2,500 pounds. Engineers assembled them under fire in Arctic conditions. It took 24 hours. The bridge held. Through it all, the Marines maintained their black humor. When Chinese loudspeakers promised warm food and safe passage if they surrendered, Marines shouted back recipes for cooking rice. When propaganda leaflets promised them beautiful Chinese women, they used the leaflets as toilet paper and airdropped them back. But behind the humor was steel. These men had been to hell and were fighting their way back. They'd seen friends freeze to death in their sleeping bags. They'd watched corpsmen lose fingers trying to start IVs in the cold. They'd learned that in this kind of war, victory meant getting out alive with your brothers beside you. By December 11th, the lead elements reached the sea at Hungnam. Behind them, the mountains still echoed with gunfire as the rear guard held off final Chinese attacks. They'd made it, but the cost had been terrible, and they still had to evacuate an entire division by sea while under threat of attack. The evacuation from Hungnam was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. 105,000 military personnel, 91,000 Korean refugees, 7,500 vehicles, 350,000 tons of supplies. All had to be loaded onto ships while Chinese forces pressed closer every hour. Navy Captain Edward Forney looked at the refugee situation and made a decision that went against orders. "We're taking them all," he said. "I don't care if we have to strap them to the deck. No one gets left behind for the communists." Ships designed for hundreds carried thousands. Refugees packed into cargo holds, engine rooms, anywhere with space. Children were passed hand to hand over the crowds to keep them from being crushed. On the USS Meredith Victory, a cargo ship designed for 60 people, Captain Leonard LaRue loaded 14,000 refugees. No military personnel, no weapons, just desperate people fleeing south. For 3 days in winter storms, 14,000 humans shared 5 gallons of water and what little food could be found. Not one person died during the voyage. They called it the miracle of Christmas. While the evacuation proceeded, Marines and soldiers held the perimeter. Every night brought probing attacks. Every day brought artillery fire. But the Chinese had been bloodied at Chosin. They'd lost an estimated 40,000 men to combat and cold. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. They pressed but carefully, like a fighter who'd learned respect for his opponent. Demolition teams prepared Hungnam for destruction. Everything that couldn't be evacuated would be blown up. Warehouses, fuel depots, ammunition dumps, railroad yards, the port itself. If the Chinese wanted Hungnam, they'd get rubble. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the last Marines boarded ship. General Smith was among them, keeping his promise that division commanders leave last. As the ships pulled away from the docks, engineers detonated the charges. The explosion was visible for miles, a volcanic eruption of fire and steel that turned night into day. Hungnam ceased to exist. From the ships, Marines watched the Korean coastline fade into darkness. They'd been in the Chosin Reservoir area for less than a month. In that time, they'd fought the largest battle of the Korean War, conducted the longest retreat in Marine Corps history, and inflicted casualties that crippled Chinese offensive capability for months. The numbers told one story. 1st Marine Division, 4,418 battle casualties, 7,313 non-battle casualties, mostly frostbite. Chinese 9th Army Group estimated 40,000 casualties, possibly more. But numbers couldn't capture what really happened at Chosin. Corporal Charles Polk put it simply. "We went up there as occupation troops playing war. We came back as Marines." The soft post-World War II military had been forged into something harder in that frozen hell. They'd learned lessons that would shape American military doctrine for decades. Never underestimate your enemy. Never overextend your forces. Never forget that nature can be deadlier than any human opponent. And most importantly, never leave your brothers behind. That last lesson, learned in blood and ice at Chosin, would echo through Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. It became more than policy. It became sacred. On Christmas Day, 1950, ships carrying the Chosin survivors headed south through gray seas. In the holds, Marines sang carols, shared what little alcohol could be found, and tried not to think about the friends they'd left in shallow graves along that mountain road. They'd survived. They'd escaped, but none of them had won. In war that brutal, there are no winners, only survivors. The chosen veterans returned to a nation that barely noticed. No ticker tape parades, no heroes welcome. Just a quick processing and reassignment back to the line. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. For 2 more years, the Korean War ground on in bloody stalemate. Hill 8-12, Heartbreak Ridge, Pork Chop Hill, names that meant nothing to Americans eating TV dinners in new suburban homes, names that meant everything to the men who bled for them. The war settled into a brutal routine. Take a hill. Lose it. Take it again. Young Americans and Chinese killed each other over worthless real estate while diplomats argued in Panmunjom. The mobile warfare of 1950 gave way to trench warfare reminiscent of World War I, except with modern weapons. And in Korea, the cold always came back. Veterans of Chosin were the old men now, at 21, 22 years old. They taught replacement troops how to keep weapons working in sub-zero temperatures, how to spot frostbite before it took fingers, how to hear Chinese bugles in the wind and not panic. They passed on hard-won wisdom paid for in blood. Private First Class Angelo Taormina, a Chosin survivor, wrote home in 1952, "The new kids think we're crazy. We sleep with our rifles. We keep extra socks against our skin. We never relax, they'll learn. If they live long enough, they'll learn." The Chinese had learned too. Gone were the massive human wave attacks of 1950. Now they fought smarter, using tunnels, artillery, targeted assaults. Both sides had learned that in modern war, throwing lives away accomplished nothing. The learning curve had been vertical and written in corpses. Meanwhile, in America, the war became background noise, overshadowed by the Red Scare, rock and roll, the booming economy. Americans were tired of war. They'd won the big one. This Asian conflict was confusing, distant, without clear purpose or end. Why were Americans dying for the 38th parallel? What was the point? The point, though few understood it then, was the new reality of limited war. Wars fought not for total victory, but for negotiating position. Wars where nuclear powers tested each other through proxies. Wars where winning meant not losing, and not losing was victory enough. This was the Cold War's true face. Not mushroom clouds over Moscow or Washington, but young men freezing to death in Korean mountains. Not apocalyptic showdown, but grinding attrition. The nuclear age had made total war impossible, so limited war became perpetual. On July 27, 1953, the armistice was signed. After 3 years, 2 million casualties and borders essentially unchanged from 1950. Both sides claimed victory. Both sides lied. In truth, the war had no winners, only survivors and the dead. For the Chosin veterans, the armistice brought no peace. They carried their war home in nightmares, in frostbitten fingers that ached every winter, in memories triggered by snow or the sound of bugles. They'd done their duty in a war nobody wanted to remember, in battles nobody cared to understand. They returned to build families, careers, lives. But on cold nights, they were back on that mountain road, watching their breath freeze in the air, listening for Chinese bugles, promising dying friends they wouldn't be left behind. Some wounds never heal, some cold never leaves your bones. The forgotten war created forgotten veterans. While World War II veterans were celebrated as the greatest generation, Korean War veterans disappeared into suburban anonymity. No movies glorified their sacrifice. No monuments honored their service. They called themselves the Silent Generation and lived up to the name. James Warren, the kid from Ohio who'd never seen snow before Korea, came home with 7 toes lost to frostbite and nightmares that would last 60 years. He got a job at the Ford plant in Cleveland, married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 kids, never talked about Chosin, not once. His daughter found his medals in a shoebox after he died. Navy Cross, Purple Heart, Bronze Star. She'd never known. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked her mother. "He said you wouldn't understand," her mother replied. "He said nobody who wasn't there could understand." This was the pattern repeated in thousands of American homes. Men who'd endured hell came home and buried it deep. They self-medicated with alcohol, work, silence. The term PTSD didn't exist yet, but the condition did. They just called it nerves or battle fatigue and told men to walk it off. The VA hospitals filled with Korean War veterans suffering from cold injuries that never healed. Feet that turned black every winter, hands that couldn't hold a coffee cup when the temperature dropped. The cold of Chosin followed them home, lived in their bones, reminded them every winter of what they'd endured. Some found solace in veteran organizations, meeting monthly to drink beer and not talk about the war. Just being around others who'd been there was enough. No need for words. The shared silence said everything. But as years passed, something changed. The forgotten veterans began to speak. Slowly at first, then in a flood. They wrote memoirs, gave interviews, returned to Korea to see what they'd fought for. What they found amazed them. South Korea had risen from the ashes to become an economic powerhouse. Seoul, the city they'd seen burned and broken, now gleamed with skyscrapers. The democracy they'd preserved had flourished. Children who would have grown up under communism instead became doctors, engineers, artists. In 1991, former Corporal Charles Polk returned to the Chosin Reservoir. Standing where Fox Company had made its legendary stand, he broke down completely. "All those boys," he said, "all those boys who never came home, but look what they did. Look what their sacrifice bought." The Korean people hadn't forgotten. Every year they honored the UN forces who'd saved their nation. Old Korean men would approach American veterans, bow deeply, and say simply, "Thank you." For the forgotten veterans, this gratitude meant everything. But back home, America's memory remained selective. Vietnam overshadowed Korea in the national consciousness. The Gulf War provided quick victory to erase the bitter taste of Asian conflicts. Korea remained the war between wars. Too small for World War II's glory, too early for Vietnam's reckoning. Yet the lessons of Korea shaped everything that followed. Limited war, coalition building, the importance of logistics in extreme environments, the danger of overextension, the reality that in modern war, victory is often just survival. Every American military operation since has carried Chosin's DNA. The Chosin few grew older, their numbers dwindling each year. But they'd learned something in those frozen mountains that time couldn't erase. They'd learned that ordinary men could do extraordinary things when everything depended on it. They'd learned that brotherhood forged in combat is unbreakable. They'd learned that sometimes the greatest victory is bringing your people home. Time is the cruelest enemy. It accomplishes what Chinese armies couldn't. It's slowly erasing the Chosin Marines from living memory. Every day, more of them cross their final bridge. Soon, none will remain to say, "I was there." In 2018, Technical Sergeant John Cahill returned to North Korea with a recovery team searching for American remains. At 89, he was one of the last Chosin survivors still mobile enough to make the journey. Standing in the Chosin Mountains, he spoke to the young soldiers with him. "You see those ridges? We had kids your age up there, 18, 19 years old, fighting in weather that would kill you just standing still. No thermal underwear, no high-tech gear, just guts and the Marine beside you. They died up there thinking they were protecting folks back home. Don't you ever forget that. The recovery teams have found them over the decades. Shallow graves marked with stones. Bodies preserved by the cold that killed them. Dog tags reading names from Chicago, Birmingham, Los Angeles, small town USA. Each recovery is a promise kept. We leave no one behind, even if it takes 70 years. Master Sergeant Robert Armentrout spent his retirement traveling to schools, telling students about Chosin. "They look at me like I'm talking about the Civil War," he said. "Ancient history to them, but I can still see every face of every Marine we lost. Still hear the bugles. Still feel that cold. If I don't tell their story, who will?" The numbers tell their own story. Of the 15,000 Americans who fought at Chosin, fewer than 2,000 remain alive. Soon that number will be zero. The last witness will close his eyes, and Chosin will pass from memory to history. But what they did echoes forward. In Afghanistan's mountains, Marines remembered Chosin's lessons about fighting in extreme terrain. In Iraq's urban warfare, the principle of bringing everyone home guided operations. Every generation of Marines learns about frozen Chosin, about advancing in a different direction, about ordinary men doing impossible things. The Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington bears the inscription, "Freedom is not free." It's a simple truth that the Chosin veterans understood in their bones. Freedom costs. It costs 18-year-olds from Iowa who freeze to death on Korean mountains. It costs medics who lose fingers saving wounded. It costs families who get telegrams instead of homecomings. Yet when asked if it was worth it, Chosin veterans invariably say yes. Not for glory, there was none. Not for recognition, it never came. But for the man beside them and the folks behind them. That's what made them fight in impossible cold against impossible odds. That's what makes their story matter. Private First Class Kenneth Myrtle, wounded at Chosin, spent his last years visiting South Korean exchange students at his local university. "I show them my frostbite scars," he said. "Tell them that's what their freedom cost. They cry every time, every single time. That's when I know it meant something. The Chosin generation is almost gone. Their war remains forgotten by most Americans." But in the end, maybe that's fitting. They never fought for fame or recognition. They fought because it was their duty, because their brothers needed them, because somebody had to stand between darkness and light. They were ordinary men who met extraordinary circumstances with quiet courage. They endured the unendurable and accomplished the impossible. They brought their brothers home. In the end, that's all that mattered. In the end, that's everything. Dawn breaks over the Chosin Reservoir today, and it's peaceful. The mountains that once echoed with gunfire now hear only wind. The roads where Marines bled are traveled by tourists. The positions where men froze to death grow wildflowers in spring. Nature has reclaimed the battlefield, but the ghosts remain. Every winter, when the first snow falls in small American towns, old men feel it in their bones. The cold brings them back to 1950, to mountains half a world away, to the brothers they left behind. They don't talk about it much, but their families know. When Dad stares at falling snow with that 1,000-yard look, he's not here. He's there. He never really left. What did it mean, Chosin? In the grand strategy of the Cold War, it was a minor engagement in a limited war. No territory was gained, no decisive victory achieved. By conventional metrics, it was a defeat. American forces driven from ground they'd captured. But war isn't measured only in ground gained or lost. Sometimes it's measured in what you save. The 1st Marine Division saved itself through sheer will and discipline. They saved thousands of refugees who would have faced death under communist rule. They saved the concept that American forces don't abandon their own. They saved honor in a situation designed to destroy it. More than that, they saved an idea. The idea that free men will stand against tyranny, even in the worst possible conditions, even when the world isn't watching, even when history might forget. They proved that ordinary Americans, the sons of farmers and factory workers, could face any enemy, any hardship, any challenge, and prevail through courage and brotherhood. Today, South Korea stands as one of the world's great democracies. Millions live in freedom because American teenagers held a frozen perimeter in 1950. Children grow up with possibilities that exist only because men whose names we've forgotten refused to yield when everything logical said they should. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Chosin isn't found in South Korea. It's found in every American military operation since. The principle that we leave no one behind. The understanding that warriors take care of each other. The knowledge that the human spirit, properly motivated, can endure anything. These aren't just military lessons, they're human lessons. They matter. To the Chosin few still with us, your war may be forgotten by many, but your courage echoes through time. Every Marine who's ever heard retreat hell knows what you did. Every soldier who's brought a wounded brother home followed your example. Every free person who sleeps peacefully because rough men stand ready in the night owes you a debt they don't even know exists. To those who never made it home from those frozen mountains, you are not forgotten. Your names are whispered in the wind over Chosin. Your sacrifice lives in the freedom of millions. You died thinking nobody would remember, but we remember. We will always remember, and to you watching this, their story is your story. The story of what free people can do when freedom is threatened. The story of ordinary courage in extraordinary circumstances. The story of Americans at their best when conditions were at their worst. The Chosin Marines didn't think of themselves as heroes. Heroes were for movies. They were just Marines doing their job in conditions that would break most men. But that's what real heroism looks like. Not glory-seeking, but duty-doing. Not individuals, but brothers. Not surrender, but defiance against impossible odds. Freedom is not free. Sometimes it costs everything. Sometimes it's paid for on frozen mountains by boys who should have been home for Christmas. The Chosin few paid that price in 1950. They paid it for strangers they'd never meet, for generations yet unborn, for an idea bigger than themselves. Remember them. Remember what they did. Remember what it cost. And if this story moved you, share it. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Comment below if you have family who served in Korea. Tell their stories. Keep their memory alive. Because this channel exists for one reason: to ensure that those who gave everything are never forgotten. The chosen few deserve that much. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their story told. They earned it in blood and ice on the coldest battlefield in America.